It was a quiet afternoon in the heart of downtown, the kind of day where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. People moved about their business, lost in their own worlds, completely unaware that in just a few moments their ordinary day would be turned upside down. Among the crowd was a woman named Lisa, a black woman in her early 30s, dressed casually in jeans and a leather jacket. She looked like anyone else out for a stroll, but there was something about her, a quiet confidence, a sharpness in her gaze, that hinted she was more than meets the eye. Little did anyone know, Lisa wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a Secret Service agent, trained to handle the most dangerous situations with precision and calm. But today, she wasn't on duty. Today, she was just trying to grab a coffee. Across the street, a woman named Karen was having a very different kind of day. Karen, a middle-aged white woman with a perpetually sour expression, was known in the neighborhood for her tendency to make a scene. Whether it was complaining about the temperature of her latte or accusing someone of cutting in line, Karen always seemed to find a reason to escalate things. Today, her target was a young barista who had apparently gotten her order wrong. Her voice rose sharply, drawing the attention of everyone in the cafe. "Do you even know how to do your job?" she snapped, slamming her cup on the counter. The barista, flustered and apologetic, tried to explain, but Karen wasn't having it. "I want to speak to your manager, now." Outside, a police officer named Greg was patrolling the area. Greg was a seasoned cop, well-meaning but often too quick to jump to conclusions. He prided himself on keeping the peace, but his methods sometimes left much to be desired. As he walked past the cafe, he heard Karen's raised voice and decided to investigate. "Everything okay here?" he asked, stepping inside. Karen immediately turned to him, her face lighting up with relief. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. This girl is completely incompetent, and now she's refusing to fix my order." Greg glanced at the barista, who looked like she was on the verge of tears, and then back at Karen. "Ma'am, let's calm down and figure this out," he said, though his tone suggested he was already siding with her. Meanwhile, Lisa had just stepped out of a nearby coffee shop, her drink in hand when she noticed the commotion. She paused, her instincts kicking in. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her. She watched as Karen continued to berate the barista, her voice growing louder and more aggressive. Greg, the officer, seemed to be doing little to de-escalate the situation. If anything, he was making it worse. Lisa sighed. She hadn't planned on getting involved, but she couldn't just stand by and watch this unfold. She crossed the street, her movements calm and deliberate, and approached the cafe. As she stepped inside, Karen immediately turned her attention to her. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone dripping with disdain. Lisa ignored her and addressed the barista directly. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. The barista nodded, though her hands were shaking. Karen, however, wasn't about to be ignored. "Excuse me, I'm talking to you," she snapped, stepping closer to Lisa. Greg, sensing the tension, moved to intervene. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back," he said, his hand resting on his belt. Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Step back? I'm just trying to make sure she's okay," she said, her voice steady. Karen scoffed. "Oh, please, you're just causing more trouble, officer. Do something." Greg hesitated, his eyes flicking between Lisa and Karen. He didn't know what to make of Lisa. She seemed calm, almost too calm, and there was something about her demeanor that made him uneasy. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some ID," he said finally, his tone firm. Lisa tilted her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "ID? For what?" she asked. "For causing a disturbance," Greg replied, though even he didn't sound convinced. Karen crossed her arms, a smug look on her face. "That's right. Let's see who you really are." Lisa reached into her jacket, her movements slow and deliberate. She pulled out a small black wallet and handed it to Greg. He opened it, his eyes widening as he read the contents. His face paled and he quickly snapped the wallet shut, handing it back to her. I'm sorry, ma'am," he stammered, his earlier confidence gone. Karen frowned, confused. What? What is it? She demanded. Greg shook his head, his voice low. You don't want to know. Lisa's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Now, she said, her tone icy. Why don't we all take a deep breath and start over? The room fell silent, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but something in Lisa's gaze stopped her cold. Greg shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of what to do next. And Lisa? She just stood, there calm and composed, as if she'd been in control of the situation the entire time. But this was far from over. In fact, it was only the beginning. Because what none of them realized was that Lisa wasn't just a Secret Service agent. She was on a mission, and this little confrontation was about to blow wide open. Lisa's calm demeanor was like a mask, hiding the storm of thoughts swirling beneath the surface. She hadn't planned on revealing her identity today, but sometimes life had a way of forcing your hand. As she stood there, watching Karen's smug expression falter and Greg's confidence crumble, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. But this wasn't about winning a petty argument. This was about something much bigger, something that had brought her to this quiet downtown street in the first place. The truth was, Lisa wasn't just in the neighborhood for a coffee. She was tracking a lead, a thread in a much larger web of danger that had been unraveling for weeks. A high-profile case involving a network of criminals operating under the radar had brought her here, and every move she made was calculated. The cafe, the barista, even Karen and Greg, they were all pieces of a puzzle she was trying to solve. But now, with her cover potentially blown, she had to think fast. She couldn't afford to let this distraction derail her mission. Karen, still oblivious to the gravity of the situation, wasn't ready to back down. What's going on? She demanded, her voice shrill. Why are you just standing there? She's clearly causing trouble. Greg shot her a warning look, but Karen was too worked up to notice. Lisa, however, wasn't about to let this escalate further. Ma'am, she said, her tone firm but calm. I suggest you take a seat and let the officer handle this. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but something in Lisa's voice made her hesitate. For the first time, she seemed to realize that she might have bitten off more than she could chew. Greg, meanwhile, was struggling to regain his composure. He had seen Lisa's credentials, and they had left him shaken. He had never encountered a Secret Service agent in the field before, and the realization that he had almost mishandled the situation was making his stomach churn. Ma'am, he said, addressing Lisa with a newfound respect, is there anything I can do to assist you? Lisa gave him a small nod. Just keep the peace, she said. I'll handle the rest. Greg nodded, though he still looked uneasy. He turned to Karen, who was now sitting at a nearby table, her arms crossed and her face flushed with anger. Let's just take it easy, okay? He said, though it was clear he was speaking more to himself than to her. As the tension in the cafe began to ease, Lisa's mind was already racing ahead. She needed to get out of there to regroup and figure out her next move. But before she could leave, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from her partner, Mark. We've got a problem. Meet me at the safe house ASAP. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. If Mark was reaching out, it could only mean one thing. Things were about to get a lot more complicated. She slipped her phone back into her pocket and turned to Greg. I need to go, she said, but I'll be in touch. Greg nodded, though. He looked like he wanted to ask a dozen questions. Lisa didn't give him the chance. She turned on her heel and walked out of the cafe, her mind already focused on the task at hand. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she scanned the street, her trained eyes taking in every detail. The crowd, the cars, the buildings, everything was a potential threat, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Meanwhile, back in the cafe, Karen was fuming. What just happened? She muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. Greg sighed, running a hand through his hair. You don't want to know, he said. Just be glad she didn't press charges. Karen's eyes widened. Press Charges? For what? Greg shook his head. Trust me, you don't want to mess with her. Let's just leave it at that. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but something in Greg's expression stopped her. For the first time, she felt a flicker of doubt. Maybe she had gone too far this time. Outside, Lisa was already on the move. She walked briskly, her eyes scanning the street for any signs of trouble. She knew she was being watched. She could feel it in her gut. The question was, by whom? The criminals she was tracking, or someone else entirely? She couldn't be sure, but she wasn't about to take any chances. She ducked into an alley, her hand instinctively going to the weapon concealed beneath her jacket. She paused, listening for any sounds that might indicate she was being followed. The alley was quiet, but that didn't mean she was alone. As she made her way to the safe house, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The case she was working on was bigger than anything she had ever dealt with before. It wasn't just about catching a few bad guys. It was about dismantling an entire network, one that had its fingers in everything from money laundering to human trafficking. And now, with her cover potentially compromised, the stakes were higher than ever. She couldn't afford to make a single mistake. When she finally reached the safe house, Mark was waiting for her. He looked tense, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a sense of urgency. "What's going on?" Lisa asked as soon as she stepped inside. Mark didn't waste any time. "We've got a leak," he said. "Someone's been feeding information to the other side. They know about the operation, and they know about you." Lisa's heart sank. This was worse than she had thought. "Do we know who it is?" she asked. Mark shook his head. "Not yet, but we're working on it. In the meantime, you need to lay low. If they find you..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Lisa knew what was at stake. If the wrong people found out who she was, it wouldn't just mean the end of the operation, it could mean the end of her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "What's the plan?" she asked. Mark handed her a file. "We've got a new lead," he said. "But it's risky. You'll need to go undercover, deeper than you've ever gone before. Are you up for it?" Lisa didn't hesitate. "I'm in," she said. Mark nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Just be careful," he said. "We can't afford to lose you." As Lisa left the safe house, her mind was already racing ahead. She had a new mission now, one that would take her into the heart of the enemy's territory. But first, she needed to tie up some loose ends. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "It's me," she said when the line connected. "I need a favor." The voice on the other end was calm, reassuring. "What do you need?" Lisa took a deep breath. "I need you to keep an eye on someone for me. A cop named Greg, and a woman named Karen. I have a feeling they might be more involved in this than they realize." As she ended the call, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap, but she didn't have a choice. The stakes were too high and the clock was ticking. She just hoped she could stay one step ahead of the game. Because if she didn't, it wouldn't just be her life on the line. It would be the lives of countless others. And that was a risk she couldn't afford to take. As Lisa stepped back into the bustling streets, the weight of her mission pressed heavily on her shoulders. The city seemed louder now, every honk, shout, and footstep amplifying the chaos in her mind. She had to stay focused. The leak Mark had mentioned was a ticking time bomb, and if she didn't act fast, the entire operation could collapse. But first she needed to figure out who was behind it. Was it someone within her own team? Or was it an outsider who had somehow infiltrated their circle? The questions swirled in her head, each one more unsettling than the last. Meanwhile, Greg was still reeling from the encounter at the cafe. He sat in his patrol car, staring blankly at the steering wheel, replaying the moment Lisa had handed him her credentials. He had never felt so out of his depth. Secret Service agents didn't just show up in his district without a reason, and the fact that she had been so calm, so in control, made him wonder what kind of storm was brewing. He picked up his radio, hesitated, then put it back down. Who? Could he even call about this? His superiors? What would he say? Hey, I just ran into a Secret Service agent who might be investigating something big, but I have no idea what it is. No, that wouldn't go over well. He sighed and started the car, deciding to drive around and clear his head. But deep down he knew this wasn't over. Lisa's words echoed in his mind. I'll be in touch. What did that even mean? Karen, on the other hand, was back at her apartment, pacing her living room like a caged animal. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had been humiliated, and it was eating away at her. Who was that woman? And why had Greg backed down so quickly? She grabbed her phone and started scrolling through social media looking for any clues. Maybe she could find something, anything, that would explain what had happened. But her search turned up nothing. Frustrated, she threw her phone onto the couch and slumped into a chair. She wasn't used to feeling powerless, and she didn't like it one bit. This isn't over, she muttered to herself. I'll find out who she is, and then we'll see who's in charge. Unbeknownst to Karen, her determination was about to lead her down a dangerous path. As she sat there, stewing in her anger, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. You want answers? Meet me at the corner of 5th and Elm. Come alone. Karen's heart raced. Was this a joke? A trap? She didn't know, but her curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed her coat and headed out the door, her mind racing with possibilities. Back at the safe house, Mark was poring over a stack of files, trying to piece together the puzzle. The leak had thrown everything into disarray, and he was struggling to keep up. He knew Lisa was out there digging into the case, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. Any updates? He asked when the line connected. The voice on the other end was grim. We've got a name. Someone inside the network has been talking, but it's not much to go on. Mark clenched his jaw. Keep digging. We need to find out who's behind this before it's too late. As the night wore on, the city seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching longer and deeper. Lisa moved through the streets like a ghost, her senses on high alert. She had a meeting to attend, one that could either break the case wide open or get her killed. She had gone undercover before, but this time felt different. The stakes were higher, the risks greater. She checked her watch and quickened her pace. She couldn't afford to be late. At the same time, Karen arrived at the corner of 5th and Elm, her nerves on edge. The street was deserted, the only sound, the distant hum of traffic. She looked around, her heart pounding in her chest. Hello? She called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. Just as she was about to leave, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that was all sharp angles and cold eyes. You wanted answers, he said, his voice low and menacing. Karen swallowed hard. Who are you? She asked. The man smirked. Let's just say I'm someone who knows a lot about your new friend. And if you play your cards right, I might just tell you what you want to know. Meanwhile, Greg had decided to take matters into his own hands. He drove to the cafe, hoping to find some clue, some hint of what Lisa was involved in. But the place was closed, the lights off, and the doors locked. He stood there for a moment, feeling utterly lost. Then his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. You're in over your head, officer. Walk away while you still can. Greg's blood ran cold. Who was sending these messages, and how did they know who he was? He looked around, half expecting to see someone watching him, but the street was empty. He pocketed his phone and got back in his car, his mind racing. He didn't know what he was getting into, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't walk away. Not now. As the night deepened, the threads of the story began to intertwine, pulling Lisa, Greg, and Karen into a web of danger and deception. Each of them was searching for answers, but the truth was more elusive and more dangerous than any of them realized. And as the clock ticked down, the tension continued to build, leaving everyone on edge. What would happen next? Who could be trusted? And who would make it out alive? The answers were still out of reach, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. But one thing was certain. The game was far from over. The night was thick with tension, the kind that made the air feel heavy and every sound seem amplified. Lisa moved through the dimly lit streets like a shadow, her senses on high alert. She was heading to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place she had been tipped off about by a source she wasn't entirely sure she could trust. But trust was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. The stakes were too high and the clock was ticking. As she approached the warehouse, she paused, scanning the area for any signs of danger. The building loomed ahead, its windows dark and its doors slightly ajar. It was the perfect place for a trap or a breakthrough. Lisa took a deep breath and stepped inside. The interior was just as ominous as the outside, with stacks of crates and machinery casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. Lisa moved cautiously, her hand resting on the weapon concealed beneath her jacket. She could hear faint voices in the distance, muffled but urgent. She followed the sound, her footsteps silent against the concrete floor. As she rounded a corner, she saw them. A group of men huddled around a table, their faces tense and their voices low. Lisa recognized one of them immediately. Victor Kane, a known associate of the criminal network she was trying to dismantle. Her heart raced. This was it. She was close, so close. But she had to be careful. One wrong move, and the entire operation could blow up in her face. Meanwhile, Karen was sitting in a dimly lit room, her hands trembling as she faced the man who had lured her here. He had introduced himself as Jack, but she wasn't sure if that was his real name. He had promised her answers, but so far all he had done was ask questions. "Tell me everything you know about the woman from the cafe," he said, his voice cold and demanding. Karen shook her head. "I don't know anything. She just showed up and started causing trouble." Jack leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. "Think harder. Did she say anything, do anything? This is important." Karen felt a chill run down her spine. She had no idea what she had gotten herself into, but she knew one thing for sure. She was in way over her head. Back at the police station, Greg was sitting at his desk, staring at his computer screen. He had spent the last few hours digging into Lisa's background, trying to piece together who she was and what she was involved in. But the more he searched, the more questions he had. Her records were classified, her history a blank slate. It was as if she didn't exist. Greg rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. He had no idea what he was dealing with, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to go down. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was another message from the unknown number. "You're running out of time, officer. Stay out of this if you know what's good for you." Greg clenched his fists. He wasn't about to back down. Not now. At the warehouse, Lisa was inching closer to the group of men, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear snippets of their conversation. Something about a shipment, a deadline, and a name she didn't recognize. She needed to get closer, to hear more. But as she took another step, the floor creaked beneath her. The men froze, their heads snapping in her direction. Lisa held her breath, her hand tightening on her weapon. For a moment, there was silence. Then one of the men barked, "Who's there?" Lisa didn't wait to find out what would happen next. She stepped out of the shadows, her weapon drawn. "Federal agent," she said, her voice steady. "Hands where I can see them." The men hesitated, their eyes darting between Lisa and each other. Victor Kane smirked, his expression dark and calculating. Well, he said. "Looks like we've got company." Lisa's grip on her weapon tightened. "You're under arrest," she said. "All of you." But before she could make another move, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. More men appeared, their weapons drawn. Lisa's heart sank. She was outnumbered and there was no backup coming. She had walked right into a trap. Back in the dimly lit room, Karen was starting to panic. Jack had been grilling her for what felt like hours and she had nothing to show for it. "Please," she begged. "I don't know anything, just let me go." Jack leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You're not going anywhere," he said. Not until I get what I want. Karen's mind raced. She had to find a way out of this, but she had no idea how. Just as she was about to say something, the door burst open. A man stepped inside, his face grim. "We've got a problem," he said. "The agent's here." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Where?" The man hesitated. "At the warehouse. But she's not alone." Greg, meanwhile, had decided to take matters into his own hands. He had traced Lisa's last known location to the warehouse, and he wasn't about to sit back and do nothing. He drove through the empty streets, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew he had to try. As he pulled up to the warehouse, he saw the faint glow of lights inside. He grabbed his radio and called for backup, but he didn't wait for a response. He couldn't. He stepped out of his car, his hand resting on his weapon, and approached the building. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the promise of violence. Greg took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Inside, the situation was escalating quickly. Lisa was surrounded, her weapon trained on Victor Kane, but the men around her were closing in. She knew she couldn't take them all, but she wasn't about to go down without a fight. "Last chance," she said, her voice cold and steady. "Drop your weapons." Victor laughed, a harsh grating sound. "You're in no position to make demands, Agent." Lisa's finger tightened on the trigger. She was about to fire when the sound of a gunshot echoed through the warehouse. Everyone froze. Lisa turned, her heart pounding, and saw Greg standing in the doorway, his weapon drawn. "Police!" he shouted. "Everyone, drop your weapons." For a moment, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. The men opened fire, and Lisa and Greg dove for cover. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, the sound deafening. Lisa returned fire, her movements precise and calculated. She had been in situations like this before, but never like this. Never with so much on the line. Greg, meanwhile, was struggling to keep up. He wasn't used to this kind of firefight, and it showed. But he wasn't about to give up. He fired back, his shots wild but determined. The warehouse was a war zone, the air thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. As the battle raged on, Lisa's mind was racing. She had to find a way out of this, but the odds were stacked against her. She glanced at Greg, who was crouched behind a crate, his face pale but determined. "We need to get out of here," she shouted over the noise. Greg nodded, but before he could respond, a bullet grazed his arm. He cried out in pain, clutching the wound. Lisa's heart sank. This was bad, really bad. She had to think fast. But before she could come up with a plan, the sound of sirens filled the air. Backup had arrived. But was it too late? The men were retreating, disappearing into the shadows. But Lisa knew this wasn't over. Victor Kane was still out there, and he wasn't about to let this go. As the police stormed the warehouse, Lisa helped Greg to his feet. "You okay?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. Greg nodded, though he was clearly in pain. "Yeah," he said. "But what about you? What's really going on here?" Lisa hesitated. She wanted to tell him everything, but there was no time. "It's complicated," she said, "but I need your help. Can I count on you?" Greg looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. "Yeah," he said. "You can count on me." As the chaos around them began to settle, Lisa knew the worst was yet to come. The criminal network was still out there, and they were more dangerous than ever. But she wasn't alone anymore. She had Greg, and together, they might just have a chance. But as the sirens wailed and the smoke cleared, one question remained. Would it be enough? The answer was still out of reach, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. And as the night deepened, the tension continued to build, leaving everyone on edge. What would happen next? Who would make it out alive? The climax was coming, and there was no turning back. The warehouse was a chaotic mess of flashing lights, shouting officers, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. Lisa helped Greg to his feet, her mind racing as she tried to piece together their next move. The arrival of the police had scattered Victor Kane and his men, but she knew better than to think they were gone for good. These people didn't just disappear. They regrouped, reorganized, and came back stronger. And now, with Greg injured and her cover potentially blown, the stakes were higher than ever. As paramedics rushed over to tend to Greg's wound, Lisa stepped back, her eyes scanning the scene. She needed to think, to plan, but there was no time. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, her heart sinking as she read the message. "You're running out of time. The package is moving. 12th and Harbor, don't be late." Lisa's stomach churned. The package could only mean one thing: the shipment Victor Kane had been talking about. It was the key to the entire operation, and if it got away, everything she had worked for would be for nothing. She glanced at Greg, who was now sitting on the edge of an ambulance, his arm bandaged and his face pale. She wanted to tell him everything, to bring him fully into the fold. But she couldn't. Not yet. There was too much at stake. "Greg," she said, stepping closer, "I need to go. There's something I have to take care of." Greg looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and determination. "You're not going alone," he said, his voice firm. "I'm in this now, whether you like it or not." Lisa hesitated. She didn't want to drag him deeper into this mess, but she also knew she couldn't do it alone. "Fine," she said finally. "But you have to do exactly what I say. No questions. Understood?" Greg nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely happy about it. Understood. Meanwhile, Karen was still trapped in the dimly lit room, her nerves frayed and her patience wearing thin. Jack had left her alone for what felt like hours, and the silence was unbearable. She had tried the door, but it was locked. She had tried her phone, but there was no signal. She was trapped and she had no idea what was going to happen next. Just as she was about to give up hope, the door creaked open. Karen's heart leapt into her throat as a figure stepped inside. It wasn't Jack. It was a woman, tall and imposing, with a cold, calculating gaze. "Who are you?" Karen asked, her voice trembling. The woman smirked. "Let's just say I'm someone who can get you out of here," she said. "But it's going to cost you." Karen's mind raced. She didn't trust this woman, but what choice did she have? "What do you want?" she asked. The woman stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Information," she said. "About the woman from the cafe. Tell me everything you know and I'll make sure you walk out of here alive." Karen hesitated. She didn't know much, but she knew enough to get herself into trouble. And if this woman was offering her a way out, maybe it was worth the risk. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll tell you what I know, but you have to promise me you'll let me go." The woman's smirk widened. "You have my word." As Lisa and Greg made their way to 12th and Harbor, the tension between them was palpable. Greg was clearly in pain, but he refused to back down. "You still haven't told me what's really going on," he said as they drove. Lisa gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "It's complicated," she said. "But the short version is that we're dealing with a criminal network that's involved in everything from money laundering to human trafficking. And if we don't stop them tonight, a lot of people are going to get hurt." Greg nodded, though he still looked uneasy. "And where do I fit into all of this?" Lisa glanced at him. "You're here because I need someone I can trust. And right now, that's you." When they reached 12th and Harbor, the scene was eerily quiet. The docks were deserted, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the piers. Lisa parked the car and stepped out, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. "Stay close," she said to Greg as they moved toward the warehouses. The air was thick with tension, every shadow a potential threat. As they approached one of the buildings, Lisa heard voices, low, urgent, and coming from inside. She gestured for Greg to stay back as she crept closer, her weapon drawn. Peering through a crack in the door, she saw them. Victor Kane and his men, along with a group of people she didn't recognize. They were loading crates onto a truck, their movements hurried and tense. Lisa's heart raced. This was it. The shipment. She had to stop them, but she was outnumbered and outgunned. She turned to Greg, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to call for backup," she said. Greg nodded, pulling out his phone. But before he could dial, a voice rang out behind them. "Well, well, look who decided to show up." Lisa spun around, her weapon raised, and saw Jack standing there, a smug grin on his face. And beside him was Karen, her hands bound and her face pale with fear. Lisa's stomach dropped. This was bad. Really bad. "Let her go," she said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. Jack chuckled. "I don't think so. You see, we've got a little problem here. You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, and now it's time to pay the price." Lisa's mind raced. She had to think fast. But before she could come up with a plan, Greg stepped forward, his weapon drawn. "Let her go," he said, his voice firm. "Or I'll make sure you regret it." Jack's grin widened. "Brave words, officer. But you're outnumbered and outmatched." As if on cue, more men appeared, surrounding Lisa and Greg on all sides. The tension was unbearable, the air thick with the promise of violence. Lisa glanced at Greg, her heart pounding. They were in way over their heads, and there was no way out. But she wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not ever. As the men closed in, Lisa's mind raced with possibilities. She had to find a way out of this, but the odds were stacked against her. And then, just as the situation seemed hopeless, a new voice cut through the tension. "Drop your weapons now." Lisa turned, her heart leaping into her throat, and saw Mark standing there, his weapon drawn and his eyes cold. Behind him were a dozen agents, all armed and ready for a fight. The tide was turning, but the battle was far from over. As the standoff continued, Lisa knew the worst was yet to come. The criminal network was still out there, and they weren't about to go down without a fight. But with Mark and Greg by her side, she felt a flicker of hope. They were in this together, and together they might just have a chance. But as the tension reached its breaking point, one question remained. What would happen next? The answer was still out of reach, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. And as the night deepened, the stakes continued to rise, leaving everyone on edge. The climax was coming, and there was no turning back.